Good morning, everybody. Hi, welcome to New America. It's great to see a full house here today. My name is Kevin Carey. I'm the Vice President for Education Policy here. I am delighted to be here to kick off the presentation of New America's third annual Varying Degrees poll of public opinion about higher education. We've got a lot of really great in-depth results that you'll hear in a few minutes, and some great panelists who will come in and discuss what they mean and how to think about them, so I will only say a few words. We started this poll 3 years ago because there wasn't anything like it out there. And I think the reason that no one had taken the time to explore public opinion in depth around higher education is because we kind of knew what it was, which was everyone thought it was fine. Everyone felt great about American higher education for a long time. There was a place for everyone, and everyone in their place. It was affordable. It was an engine of opportunity. It was a magnet to attract talent from around the world. And our research universities were a driver of innovation in our economy. And many of those things, I think, are still true to some extent, but it's clear now that the public is not entirely content with our higher education system. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and most of them are pretty familiar to those of us who live and breathe this stuff all the time. With the benefit of hindsight and a little distance now, it's very clear that the subject of price and particularly student debt has really become embedded in our culture. In the way that particularly the newest generation of college students who were beset by the combination of rising prices and a catastrophic labor market with lasting damaging effects now kind of understand themselves, their relationship with higher education, and increasingly their kids' relationship with higher education. It is a much more complicated and less universally positive set of ideas and set of feelings. At the same time, we also see, I think, higher education being caught up in the overall growing politicization of our national dialogue. We start to see bifurcation in the educational composition of people who identify with different political parties that didn't used to be there before, and we see cultural issues, particularly around speech and freedom of expression, being refracted through how we see our colleges and our universities. And so for all of those reasons, we dug deep in this survey on all of those questions. And because we have an election coming up next year, as you may be aware, we really tried to focus on how people who identified with different political parties understand and think about higher learning. I will leave it to our presenters and our panelists to go in depth on the data, but I will make kind of a couple of broad observations, which is the good news is that I think people remain as committed as they have been to the fundamental premise of higher learning as an engine of opportunity. They believe and they know how important it is for people to go on after they finish high school and get a high quality education of a variety of different kinds that lead to employment and citizenship. That remains steady, I think. What is less steady is their faith in the institutions and the policies that we have charged to provide that higher education. While on the one hand, people are broadly enthusiastic about spending more public money to make higher education better and more affordable, they also definitely believe that these institutions should be held accountable in ways that, frankly, they are not held accountable now. So I think those things, and I think the results of this survey should embolden those of us who are have an opportunity to weigh in on higher education policy. There is room out there in the public opinion to make changes, not incremental changes, but real changes, particularly as we head toward a new referendum on our national politics and potentially a once-in-a-decade opportunity to reshape the way the federal government structures the incentives that govern our higher education system. So again, I'm delighted you're here. It's going to be a great conversation. Just a couple of notes. I do want to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their generous financial support for this project. And I also want to note one person who's not here today is my colleague, Rachel Fishman, without whom this project would not be possible. Fortunately, she's not here because she's home taking care of her brand new baby girl. So a future college student, yes, absolutely. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alejandra Acosta, who is going to present the results of the survey. And then around 10 o'clock, we'll start with our panel discussion. So, Alejandra.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Kevin said, my name is Alejandra Acosta. I'm a relatively new policy analyst here at New America on the higher ed team, and I'm really excited to be presenting our findings with you all today. So thank you, Kevin, for providing some context for this project and help us kind of frame the findings that we're about to go through today. I will be sharing some of the survey top lines with you all. There is a lot more to the survey than what we'll present here today, but we'll get to that a little bit later. I was told this clicker was finicky, and they were right. There we go. Great. So before we get started with the findings, I do want to talk a little bit about how we conducted this survey, particularly because this year there were a lot of changes. In order to make varying degrees even better than the prior 2 years, we've made some changes, and the biggest one was working with a new partner. And with this new partner, we were able to use an online platform to ask more questions that got us to more nuance, more information, and a greater diversity of answers from our survey takers. In prior years, this survey was conducted primarily through landlines and through mobile phones, but this year we have it online with some mobile phone usage as well. With the online platform, we asked a lot more questions than other years, and as Kevin said, we also focused a lot on party identification because just in case you weren't aware, there's an election next year. This survey was conducted this past spring. We had a total sample size of just over 2,000 adults, 18 and over, and we collected a few oversamples of some groups of Americans, including African Americans, Latinx Americans, Asian Americans, and college students, who we defined as those enrolled in an associate's or bachelor's degree program. Our margin of error was about 3.35%. I won't bore you more with the details of the survey. We'll get right to the juicy stuff. So first, I think the simplest but probably almost most impactful finding that we had from our survey is that Americans want change in higher education. Only 1 in 3 Americans is satisfied with higher education the way it is now. And 2/3 of our survey takers felt that they were not satisfied with education as it is now. And so I think that implies a great desire for change and a great desire to see things done differently than how they are now. And I think it also shows a great responsibility for those of us in the room who work in higher education to push for that change too. This finding was particularly interesting to our team because it came with quite a bit of nuance. So here we see that Americans think that well-paying jobs may not require an education after high school. So when presented with the statement, there are lots of well-paying, stable jobs that people can find with only a high school diploma or GED, about 62% agreed with this statement. And so that was interesting because we're not quite sure what those jobs are. I mean, my career as a YouTube influencer hasn't really taken off yet, but that is how the American people feel. And this year we have about 37% of people who did not agree with the statement. So Americans think that there are plenty of well-paying jobs that you can get without any sort of education beyond high school, but at the same time, they feel that education beyond high school creates better opportunities. So here we have over 90% of Americans agreeing that an education beyond high school offers pathways for upward economic mobility. And at the same time, 78% of Americans said that an education beyond high school offers a good return on investment for students. So Americans feel that you don't necessarily need an education beyond high school to get a good paying job, but they also feel very strongly, very, very strongly about how higher education can create better opportunities for people. And on the hot topic of affordability, just under half of Americans think that an education after high school is affordable. Only 48% of Americans agree that they can get a high-quality education after high school that is also affordable. And this was also a bit nuanced or had a bit more depth. There's a bit more depth to this finding as well, because fewer than half of Americans think that an education is affordable. How do they think that this education should become more affordable? Well, they believe that government funding should be increased. We have this year 83% of Americans believing that the federal government should spend more tax dollars on making opportunities after high school more affordable. And 86% think that states should be spending more money to make education after high school more affordable. This year we have only about 40% disagreeing with this, with the federal government spending more tax dollars on making higher education more affordable, and again also only about 41% disagreeing with that statement for state funding. So Americans do feel that they want these opportunities after high school to be more affordable, and it seems like there is a lot of support and need for the federal and state government to be providing a lot of that funding, according to American public opinion. This report was pretty long. We do have a lot more findings, and we would like to be able to share more of those with you all. But you can find more of those results online, and we will show you the link to that a little bit later. But these are some of the findings that our team felt were most interesting, that encompassed the overall findings of the report and the overall sentiments of the American people. So we hope that you find that interesting. Take it with a grain of salt, and also look more into our report to see all of the nuance, all of the different findings, and all of the sentiments that the folks that we work for have about higher education in the United States. So that's what I have for the presentation portion of our data. Now I want to get a little bit more interactive with you all. There was a section in our report called Perception versus Reality. And in this section of our report, we asked our survey takers to answer some questions about different facts and figures about higher education. And then in our report, we actually compared those to the real facts, figures, and statistics. So now we want to do that here with you all too. We want to compare the perception in the room with the perception of Americans with the reality of different facts and figures. And we're going to focus this part today on student debt. This will set us up nicely for the two panels that we have a little bit later. So to get started, please take out your phone if you haven't already. And you will text New America Ed to the phone number 22333, and that will get us started into our poll. First, we will start with a test question just to make sure that this is working. So our first question is, are you ready to further explore Varying Degrees 2019? And you have two options. You can either be excited or really excited. So if your answer is absolutely, please send A in your text, in the following text message. And if you want us to please take you there right away, then you send B in your text message. And we get to see live how you all feel about further exploring Varying Degrees 2019.
You're honest.
I'll give about 5 more seconds. Cool, thankfully everyone looks really excited about this. There is no reality for this question. The reality is that we're going to continue on to our perception versus reality section. So there is nothing to compare here, but just wanted to make sure that this works for you all. I'm excited to be a little bit more interactive with you all here. So one of the questions we asked folks was, which of the following items do you think is the largest source of consumer debt? And we have the options of credit card debt, mortgage/home equity loan debt, auto loans, or student loans. And so now we would like to ask you all what you think is the largest source of consumer debt. So if you think it's credit card debt, please send A. Mortgages and home equity loans is B. Auto loans is C. And student loans is D. All right, I don't see a lot more movement in the graph, so it looks like, oh, nope, never mind. Okay, I think we're done now. So it looks like in this room, the perception is that mortgages, a little more movement. Mortgages and home equity loans are the largest source of consumer debt. This is what you all think here in this room. Followed by that, we have student loans. 36% of you think that that's the largest source of consumer debt. And interestingly, nobody thinks that auto loans is the largest source of consumer debt. So that's the perception with this room. Now I want to compare it to the perception of those that took our survey, the perception of Americans. So it's a little small, but the perception of Americans is that student loans are the greatest source of consumer debt. 47% of Americans thought that student loans are the largest source of consumer debt. And that's followed by, where do we go? By credit card debt. The source of debt that Americans thought was the second, or most popularly thought was the largest source of consumer debt was credit card debt. And then after that, it was mortgages and home equity loans. So most popular answer was student loan debt, then credit card debt, and then mortgage and home equity loans. So that's very different from the perception. In this room, I'll blame it on all of you all being experts in higher ed and being very familiar with this type of data. But this is the way that the rest of our country and the rest of our society thinks things are at the moment. So Americans think that student loans are the greatest source of consumer debt. But in reality, those here in this room, you all were correct. Mortgage debt and home equity loans are actually the largest source of consumer debt, followed by student debt. So student debt is in second place, but it is at a much, much lower amount than home equity loan debt. So it's pretty interesting to see that, especially in the context of the student debt discourse that's going on right now, especially with the upcoming election. So now on to our second question. Of recent college graduates with a bachelor's degree who took out student loans, what do you estimate is the average student debt upon graduation? Do you feel that it's $10,000 or less, between $10,000 and $20,000, between $20,000 and $30,000, between $30,000 and $40,000, or more than $40,000? I feel like you all cheated. Did you look at the report before? Alrighty, so it looks pretty clearly that in this room we believe that the average student debt is between $20,000 and $30,000. I won't wait too much more for the little adjustments, but I do want to share that Americans believe that the average student loan debt is more than $40,000. That was the most popular answer in our survey. And almost 70% of people believed that the average student debt was over $30,000. So if you can see on the far end of our graph, those are the most popular answers, and that was between 30 and 40, and 40 and over. So over 70% of Americans believe that the average student debt is over $30,000. But in reality, the average student debt is just under 30 at $28,650. And that's for both public and private nonprofit institutions in 2019. So Americans thought that the average was a bit higher. Again, there's a lot of things that we can attribute to that. I'm going to blame you all for being experts on this topic for getting it right. That was no fun. But that is essentially our two most interesting findings regarding debt, regarding how Americans perceive debt for higher education in the United States and the reality of it. So I think, as Kevin shared, there's a lot of work to do for us, a lot of educating and a lot of helping people understand the reality of education after high school in the United States. So good job, you basically got the answers right. With that, I hope you enjoyed some of our top findings. You can explore our data more at newamerica.org/varying-degrees. And there you can play a lot with our data and see more of our findings there yourselves. So thank you so much. With that, I'm going to pass things over to my colleague Sophie, who is the Varying Degrees queen while Rachel is out on maternity leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ale. I'm not the queen, but it's okay. I take that. So thanks everyone for coming. And while we're in the mood of exploring more data, let me take a little bit of your time to introduce you guys to a tool that we just published this summer prior to Varying Degrees, which is the higher ed polling dashboard. This tool is technically an online repository of publicly available data, survey data on higher education that has been conducted since 2010. And on this tool, you will find surveys on higher ed that touch on various issues such as values, funding, teaching and learning. We have it all. And not just like listing you on the surveys that out there, when you go and click on the plus sign on each of the survey, you will see the top findings of the surveys, and you can also download the surveys. We make it easier for you to search the surveys via this filter panel, and you can do it by sample size to demographics or just by the main theme of the surveys. So I think we would update the surveys periodically. So if you are interested in survey data in higher education, or if you are someone who has to refer to survey data a lot, I think this tool will come in handy. And that's it for our presenting today. Here comes the most awaited sections of this morning events, our panels. And I'm gonna introduce the first panel, which includes 3 amazing researchers who are familiar with the issues of higher ed, finance, and the panel would be moderated by Diane Harris, who is the editor-at-large at Newsweek. And without further ado, I want to invite the first panel to come and kick off the conversation.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here. I'm Diane Harris. I am, as Sophie said, I'm an editor-at-large at Newsweek, and but spent the majority of my career at Money Magazine, where I was the editor-in-chief, the first and only woman to be editor-in-chief, if that matters. So I'm really delighted to be here. I've been covering, and by covering, mostly editing and directing coverage of higher education for a couple of decades, and it's such an important topic. As the varying degrees, as you saw from the results, there are so many misconceptions that are highlighted by the Varying Degrees survey and by a lot of other work that's out there. And it's astonishing, given what a hot topic student debt is in our country today, and with the election coming up, that there are so many things that are misunderstood about the student debt situation. I wrote about them recently in a cover story for Newsweek, which we have a few copies out there, and it echoes a lot of the findings that you will see if you dig deep into the data of the Varying Degrees survey. But for me, it's also, and I suspect for many of you and for our panelists, it's a personal issue. You know, as a student myself, a little while ago, you know, I certainly grappled with student debt, and more recently as a parent, and watching my children grapple with student debt issues. So for me, as I suspect, for our panelists and for many of you, it's personal as well as professional. And it's why I am so honored to be here with this distinguished group of panelists who are doing really, really important and insightful research in the field. And so without further ado, let me introduce them. We will be talking for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to you for questions for about 15 minutes, which is a nice period of time for Q&A, so I hope you will be robust with your questions. Fenaba Abo is sitting right here, right next to me, is an assistant professor of money, relationships, and equality in the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research examines the causes and consequences of debt and wealth inequality with a focus on higher education and family and relationships. In particular, Otto's work on racial disparities in student debt sheds light on the ways that societal inequalities stem from historical legacies of racial exclusion and discrimination and are reproduced over time. For the current academic year, she is a visiting professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Sitting next to Fenaba is Dominique Baker, is an assistant professor of education policy at Southern Methodist University. Her research focuses on the ways that policy shapes the access and success of students who are underrepresented in higher education. Her recent areas of study include the causal impact of undergraduate debt on credit accumulation, early career earnings, and graduate school enrollment. In addition to her work at SMU, Baker is also currently a researcher with the Texas On-Course Research Network, where she focuses on factors that influence the debt burden of Texas graduates. And next to Dominique is Sarah Saddlemeyer, who manages Pew's Student Borrower Success Project, which promotes successful repayment of student loans, especially among borrowers at greatest risk for delinquency and default through research and advocacy. Previously, she served on Pew's Financial Security and Mobility Project and its Economic Mobility Project, encouraging debate on how to improve opportunity in America. Before joining Pew, Saddlemeyer was also a fellow at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and has also worked for the Kaiser Family Foundation, the Urban Institute, the California Department of Healthcare Services, and the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. You do not look old enough to have that long resume. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. I've had the opportunity to read a lot of their research over the past week or so, and it's really important work. Okay, so let me just start off by asking you, politicians and pundits, and I admit it, the media, talks a lot about student debt with the word crisis attached. It's always the student debt crisis, the student debt crisis. And in reporting the Newsweek story, almost all of the experts that I talked to objected to that word. So let me just start by asking you, is that the right way to characterize what is happening with student debt in America right now? Let me start with you.
Wow, that's a great question. Whoa. Okay, so usually when I talk about this topic, I start out by showing some of the facts and figures around the average debt, and then talk about how there is this misperception about how much people have, or the average borrower has, largely because there's a smaller proportion of people at the higher end of the distribution that carry a lot of the debt, so like over $100,000. And so that's kind of bringing up the averages and kind of skewing the public perception about what is going on. However, I'll steal a little bit from my own research that I don't think it's a mischaracterization to say that it is a crisis, because if we look at specific populations or specific demographic groups, who are disproportionately burdened with student debt, and they're having troubles not only, well, we see in the accumulation of the debt and in the repayment part of how it may be affecting long-term and have long-term implications, then I think crisis is the right word to use, especially if we look at particular populations, which we can get into a little bit later.
So I have to tell you that, you talk about the questions somewhat in advance, and I didn't prepare them for this question. But we are going to get to throw them a little curveball right at the start. But we're going to go right from this into specific misperceptions. But Dominique, what do you think?
Yeah, so I am one that generally does not use the terminology of crisis, but I am normally very specific that I think when it comes to, in particular, Black students, that there is a crisis within the student loan, which is a little bit of what we're sort of alluding to here. So generally speaking, for a number of people, they borrow to achieve some amount of higher education. They achieve that amount of higher education. They are able to repay their student loans, and they benefit from that opportunity. That is a non-negligible part of the student loan borrowers in the United States. And so I think it's always important to try to think about the balance, how many students are struggling versus students who are not struggling. And I do think that where we see students that are struggling, regardless of whether they earn a credential or not, are for Black students.
Yeah, I'll echo a little bit of what Dominique said, which is that student loans are a good news story and a bad news story. So 43 million, give or take, students currently, or borrowers currently hold debt. It comes to about $1.4 trillion. And that $1.4 trillion can be misleading. Certainly, the cost of college has been rising. Certainly, people are taking out more debt. We see that in the data. But that also indicates that more people are going to college. And this can be largely women and communities of color. So I think that is the good news story. The bad news story is that about 20% of those with debt are in default. And so I like to think of it as a student loan repayment crisis. The repayment system that we have today is incredibly complex, it's outdated, and it can be cumbersome and really impact the way people are able to repay their loans.
Thank you. I'm still not sure whether to use the word crisis or not. I mean, what my conclusion was sort of what you are alluding to, which is that there is a crisis for certain groups, but to characterize all of student borrowing for college as in crisis mischaracterizes the situation. So that's sort of where I landed. Now I'd like to talk about some of those specific misconceptions, and also maybe things that are not well understood, because that's different than a misperception. So either one, what we're trying to do is give people a more accurate portrait of what's going on with student borrowing, both in the accumulation part of it and in the repayment part of it. So can I start with you, Naba? But based on your research, I'm so sorry. Talk to us about what the critical misperceptions are.
So I mean, we kind of alluded to it in the first question, and it's what I think largely stems from the work that I've done around racial disparities in student debt. And its connection to wealth inequality is that, or should I say, racial disparities are deeply rooted in wealth inequality. And so what I would say is that we see families across the board taking on a huge financial risk in order to go to college. There's a risk with pursuing higher education across the board, right? But increasingly we see an increase in the financial risk that Black families are taking on in order to send their children to college. Not only the children and the students having to bear a large financial burden, but their families as well, who are taking on additional loans. Or you can, for example, the Parent Plus loan is one example. So I think, and I alluded to it in the first response, that we see this not just, I agree with Sarah with regards to repayment, but also in the accumulation piece, right? College costs have gotten so out of control, or so high, that families, and students included in that, are have a greater financial risk. And if we don't see them completing the degree, or even, and I'll say, added to this misconception is that for Black families, there's actually evidence that even if you have the degree, you have a higher risk of default, right? So, it's not just get the degree. It's like we're getting the degree, we're doing all the things correctly, but we still have this financial burden, or these borrowers of color, in particular Black students, Black borrowers have this financial risk, higher financial risk associated with pursuing higher education.
And that the payoff is not as great.
Right, especially, so
Right?
I'm looking from my lens of the consumer science lens, but we see that this can have short and long-term lasting impacts on transitions into home ownership, whatever market you're thinking about credit. If you're defaulting, how does that hinge on your credit report? Have future borrowing more expensive? So just thinking about what this means for these borrowers in the short and long term.
Dominique?
So my two are normally that number one, when we think about who borrows and then try to think about what is sort of stable repayment, we sort of talk, right, about whether or not someone has entered default. And so one of the number one things that I always make sure that I talk to people about is the fact that the people that are most likely to default are individuals who have actually very low amounts of student loan debt burden, right? Most people in here are nodding. That's awesome. I'll still say it again. Because, right, we create an idea where we think that it is, particularly when we talk about perceptions, that it is individuals who have $45,000, $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 worth of debt that are the ones that we see the most defaults. But we always want to keep in mind, sorry, we're mic'd, and if you've ever been a woman or just anyone who's worn a dress and tried to be mic'd, it's a whole thing. So we just got words. It's incredibly important that we think about the fact that often individuals who do not complete a credential, who then also have lower amounts of student loans that they've accumulated, are often not seeing the benefit of that credential, but still have the debt burden to show for it. And so it can be really difficult to manage those repayments. So that's my number one. And then my number two is a little bit of what we've talked about here. When we talk about the ability to repay, we're not just talking about colleges and universities' roles and responsibilities. We're not just talking about students' roles and responsibilities. We're also talking about the labor market, which some people may think that colleges and universities have more or less control over. But there is a reality that for certain students, there is discrimination within the labor market as well, which can make it more challenging to feasibly manage the repayment process for their debt. That is a part of the story for borrowers of color, in particular Black borrowers, where there are pieces that come with the salaries that those students have that can make it more challenging for them to repay. This is when we can then sort of get into this discussion about a repayment crisis and what that might look like when we're trying to think about is there some sort of income-based or contingent way that we could try to help these students or things of that nature.
Sarah, before you answer, I just want to underscore a couple things that you said, because I don't think it can, obviously there are a lot of people who are very knowledgeable in this room, as we saw from the interactive portion of this. But this is going out, we're live streaming and we're sending messages to a larger audience. And it can't be underscored enough, I think, that in general, it is the smallest, the people with the smallest loans who are at greatest risk. Mm-hmm. And also, just contingent with that is that how rare, and you would not know this from especially the political rhetoric right now, how rare it is for those kinds of large loans. I mean, $100,000 and up borrowers are rare, and they're mostly graduate students or perhaps parents. But they are, for the most part, not undergraduates, and there are not many of them. They disproportionately contribute to that $1.6 trillion figure in student debt, so they're not unimportant, but in actual numbers, they're small. And I just think that that's a related point that we sort of want to address.
Oh, no, I think that's huge. And in fact, one of my favorite figures that Sarah and I actually have talked about before is this one that comes from the College Board that looks at trends in student loan borrowing. And what it shows is a breakdown of the amount of sort of outstanding loans that we have in the United States. It breaks it down by, see, this is why when you don't let an academic have a PowerPoint, right? Like I just want to, so it breaks it down by how much a student has accumulated in outstanding debt, and it says what is the share, how many borrowers have this amount, and what you can see is that overwhelmingly most individuals have very small, when we're considering an entire college education, that generally we're talking about less than $20,000. And that we see that there are some individuals who have the overwhelming lion's share of outstanding debt, but those are individuals who have gone to graduate or professional school and have amassed several degrees in order to get that debt or have attended for-profit institutions.
So I'll just underscore what Fenaba and Dominique said before and add to that two things. First, that student loans they may be the first form of debt that a traditional or someone right out of high school, college student has, but they're not the only debt and the only thing that families are worried about on their balance sheets. So we conducted a series of focus groups earlier this year across the country, and I would say a majority of what we heard when we asked about people's struggles was not specifically about student debt. So this is definitely something that contributes to financial insecurity, but that families have a lot on their plates, and when they sit down at the kitchen table and really talk about their finances, they are living one financial life, right? They're thinking about, per the data we saw earlier, they're thinking about their mortgages or their rent, they're thinking about their car payment, putting food on the table, daycare, things like that. The second is that not everyone has the same types of experiences when they're in repayment. So we have, since you guys talked about data, I'm going to also talk about data. We sort of have these snapshots in time. 9 million people are in default. Millions of people are in deferment or forbearance or delinquent on their loans. But it really matters, and I think we don't think enough about how people get there. Does it matter? It's sort of a different set of solutions and a different mechanism to repayment for someone to be in forbearance or to be in deferment for extended periods of time than for someone to just use a forbearance here or there if your car breaks down, really to make ends meet every now and then from month to month. So in order to target resources and policy and discussions toward those who are struggling most, we really need to understand what are the individual experiences that people are having, what are the pathways they're taking, and how does that impact their eventual outcomes. Where are there points along their way where there might be places where we could inject resources or really catch people before they get too far along?
What are, and I'll throw this out to whoever wants to answer in whatever order, what are some of the consequences of these misperceptions? For me, it seems to me that a lot of the debate we're hearing from the political candidates might not be focused on the things that the researchers that at least I spoke to seem to feel was the most urgent, and I don't know how you get to effective solutions as a result. So that's sort of what drove me to do the story. Can you guys address that?
Yeah. Well, I'll start off by saying that I think taking a broad view, if we have these misperceptions about where it misdirects where our focus is and where we can make policy-relevant interventions, right? So if we are looking at the wrong place, then we can't create the policies needed to properly address where the issue, and therefore help the largest amount of people, right? That's ultimately what we want to do. I was going to say something else, but you can come back to me.
Just jump in.
Yeah.
Sure. So yes, I agree that we are definitely at risk of targeting resources in the wrong place. I'll back up just a second and say, I think something that we're not talking about is that there's actually two distinct yet interrelated problems here. There's the issues of access, cost, completion on the front end, so while someone's in school, pathways to school, and then there are also these repayment issues on the back end, so whether or not someone can get into the right repayment plan, sort of how their earnings are directly related to their ability to repay. And these are certainly related. But in the policy discussion, we often talk about them as their one sort of giant problem. And I think a big risk there is that we're trying to create a one-size-fits-all policy that isn't addressing, if something happens on the front end, we sort of need to address that, and it does have impacts on the back end, but that might not be solving all the problems on the back end.
Now I remember what I was going to say. I was going to say also, if we have this perception that people are taking on a lot of debt or they're carrying around this debt, then we personalize the issue and say, well, it turns into this person made poor choices, right? And that takes the onus off of us as a society to really think about what is broken in the system that led to the larger number of people who are down at the bottom. I mean, we have to focus on the entire distribution, but what's going on with these people who have less than $20,000 worth of debt and can't make their payments, right? And what's happening is we're applying these personalized explanations to these people when it may not, it's not a personal issue, or it's not a personal responsibility issue. It's a system issue, wide issue. So that's what I was going to say. But, yeah.
No, I think my distinguished colleagues have nailed that. I would say broadly, one of the things that I always think about is a lot of what Sarah said around the idea that if we focus on, that we have to be really careful about how we target interventions. In particular, if we focus all of our time and energy, so when I have my students try to do sort of an experiment and I say, okay, I want you to tell me how you're going to fix student loans with a single policy. Give it to me. I'm going to give you a whole 30 minutes to think about it. And what they normally come to at the end of the experiment is they sort of say, well, it's hard because even if I said that I was going to sort of forgive this debt, or I was going to make all of this free, one of the things we couldn't then control is what happens if universities decide that they're going to charge more. And so then it creates a different type of scenario. So it is incredibly challenging to think of sort of a single one-stop solution that creates an environment where we have affordable higher education that we feel reaches an optimal level of individuals pursuing and achieving post-secondary credentials. So I think it's incredibly important that we think about the fact that this is a sort of big interconnected problem that means that we have to think about multiple targeted solutions.
And the way we talk about that problem really matters. The way we talk about debt impacts the decisions that people are making about borrowing, can make people hesitant to borrow, even if that's a way that they're going to access college, but it could also impact completion. So, I do not give consumer advice, so this should not be construed as such, but one could make the argument that someone who has one more semester might be better off taking debt to finish than dropping out, right? So thinking about when debt makes sense, when it doesn't make sense, but also sort of what happens in the before and after.
And actually, this is perfect, because if you read like beautiful write-ups of recent research, then you can check out one of Sue Dynarski's latest pieces in the New York Times that covers two different pieces of research that look and actually show that when you have access to ways to afford college, whether that is through potentially student debt, that it can help people to complete, to take more credits. So it is important that we think about what is an appropriate and affordable amount. Not all student debt is bad in the same way that not all debt is bad. That's why we saw, right? Like so many people have mortgages and home loans, right? Because that's how they could afford a home.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that Rachel Fishman, if you're watching, Rachel, congratulations on the baby, said to me for this story was that she worried and saw in some of the focus groups that New America conducted as part of this research that she saw a real shift in people thinking that just all student debt was bad and should be avoided at all costs, and that not seeing it as the pathway to some people's ability to get a college degree, and really worried about that. One of the other things that I saw is that in everyone that I talked to felt addressing challenges with repayment is a really, really big and important part of finding effective solutions to the problems that people have with student loans. And yet, a lot of the public discourse is on accumulation and people with big debt and blanket forgiveness. So Sarah, for this, I want to start with you and move us to talking about effective solutions. You recently did an opinion piece in which you talked about a repayment solution, a pretty simple fix. Can you talk about what that is, what issue it would address, and how it would help?
Sure. So there's some debate in the field about whether income-driven repayment is the best choice for anyone. But I don't think there's much debate about it being a good choice for struggling borrowers. But it is actually, if you are laying out all of the options before a struggling borrower, it is the hardest thing to do. And so you don't actually need a degree in behavioral economics to understand that that makes no sense. Right? The thing that we really want people to do, or that might be the best for their financial security, is actually the thing that's the most difficult to do. And so there is a fix that can happen right now. We don't have to wait for a major policy reform to happen. There's sort of a smaller thing and that would have a really big impact. And that is Congress directing the IRS to share relevant borrower data with the Department of Education. So right now, when you apply for an income-driven plan, you have to submit paperwork. It can be onerous. You have to submit your income. You have to, you're on the phone. You have to go fill out forms. You have to mail them in. We heard in our focus groups that this is a reason that people are struggling to repay. They're struggling to get into these plans. They're struggling to stay in the plans. And they're really struggling to sort of remember and also to be able to effectively return this information. And much of that information the US government already has. And so allowing this data sharing would reduce one barrier that exists right now. And to me, it's sort of the first step on the holy grail of fixing the student loan repayment system. Let's reduce a barrier that borrowers face. Let's allow those who need it most to more easily access these plans. And again, it's simple and it's something that we can do right now.
Let me move it also to the two of you. Let's shift and based on your research and just based on your being a knowledgeable expert in this field, what do you think are the most, would be the most effective solution, or what would you most like to see happen, and how does it contrast with what suggestions are out there? Too big? Too broad? Just
sure. So I will not say that this is the most effective. I will say that this is a potential, I'm going to caveat the mess out of this, that this is a potential solution, that if we're thinking on the front end, one of the things, since Sarah did such a lovely job talking about some things on the back end, particularly when I try to think around what we've said around the low amounts that are tied to the low amounts of student loan debt that are tied to our highest number of defaults, and then in particular the disproportionate reliance on debt for students of color, in particular Black students. I wonder whether or not a sort of state federal matching grant program that would put more money into institutions. We have some very strong research that talks about the fact that putting money towards resources around academic instruction and learning are some of the most effective ways to help with increasing our completion rates at colleges and universities. And so there are some proposals from people like Dave Deming that talk about what if we created a matching grant and said that this money could only be spent on increasing sort of the instructional resources within institutions that would help students that are at that sort of low cumulative debt amount with actually completing, so hopefully they're actually going to benefit from their degree. I would add a twist that I would think that we could add additional funds to minority-serving institutions, and by doing that, potentially target the communities of color that don't necessarily have the same amount of wealth as their peers, which then makes them rely more on student debt. Oh, thanks. I've been working on it.
Well, I guess similar, just to echo kind of what Sarah said, we have a program out here. We have income-based repayment. I think expanding it and thinking of ways that it can reach more of the borrowers in repayment is absolutely necessary. I'm also going to say I'm for loan forgiveness. I think we need to think about what got us into this place with so many borrowers struggling and with such amount of debt. If we go back just a couple generations, we did offer higher ed at a lower cost to people, and then through a series of changes in our tax and higher ed policies, we've burdened a whole new younger cohort of young adults with something that did not exist a couple generations ago. And so really thinking about how do we, what are we setting up our our current generation of scholars? How do we want to see them? How do we want them to be productive in this society? And if we think that this may be something that, or we believe is hindering progress, whatever, growth in our society, then I think we need to think bold and remove it. I think there's the example of what happened at Morehouse with the billionaire donor giving a grant for the graduating class, creating a grant to remove the student debt of all that, and that can be transformative in their lives not to have that. But that's one class, right? What happened to the classes before them or the classes that come after, right? And should we be relying? I mean, we can go down. Should we be relying on private donations to solve this issue? I don't think that's the case. But what it really implies is that this is an important issue that people think that if but for this debt, they may have a different pathway, right? They may be making different decisions. And so, what if it was removed? And so, I go big. Loan forgiveness.
One of the things that I think is interesting, we've talked some about how, I think student debt is a racial issue, and a lot of your research, and the research out there makes that very, very clear, and maybe we need to say that just that clearly. But it's also a women's issue, and that was another thing that was surprising. I don't know if it was surprising to me in the research. Actually, it probably wasn't. But when the story about Morehouse came out, that was an extraordinary gesture. But it was not surprising to me that it was an all-male school. And I thought a lot about that. Do you address the gender issue at all in any of your research? I know AAUW did.
So they did their report.
Yeah.
And so I have a couple of pieces. One that looks at Black women and looks at them sort of in the repayment process to talk to them. And then some work that I've done in Texas looking at debt burdens for about 5 cohorts of graduates in the state of Texas, and looked at that from both a racial and a gendered perspective. And what's interesting is that for women broadly, one of the sort of biggest areas that I have found that sort of drives the variation in what their debt burden is labor market differences, which we generally refer to as labor market discrimination. So that's one of the major pieces when it comes to women and being able to manage their debt. I think we also have very good research on sort of the high social value, low pay careers, occupations that more often than not women are the ones that work in, which is going to create that type of potential imbalance. So yeah, I think gender is a part of this. I think there's sort of a reality that our public policy systems work within our larger society. So that means that our public policy systems mirror the larger ills within our society, sexism, racism, all those sorts of pieces. So we have to be very intentional and think about those when we're trying to develop public policy in order to try to combat that.
Do you, and again, you know, anybody jump in with this, have any advice to students and parents, either based on your research or what you see out there, on navigating student debt and the current environment that we're in? We'd all love to see big, bold solutions, but while we're waiting, any advice? No advice.
Sarah's gonna keep her job. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I try to think about really carefully, and this is a real thing. Like even you know, with all the research and things like that, like I wind up hanging out with some of my sorority sisters, and they have children, and they're like, "But what am I supposed to do to pay for these kids' college?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you took me for a different kind of expert. I don't." This happened like on Saturday. So trying to think through this is really challenging, right? One of the things that I try to talk to people about is sort of a balance, both that I think that there are a lot of amazing institutions that often people sort of glance over when they're talking about what higher education is. We talk about, we often, not everyone, but we often in our minds think of very specific institutions when we think about college and universities in the United States, when there are a lot of great other types, I think that regional public institutions are some of the unsung heroes of the United States. And I think that there are ways that it is okay. So one of my biggest things actually is the idea that like the ideas of what is a quality education are often filtered through a societal idea of what prestige is. And that if at all possible, I think it's really important to try to think about what does a quality education mean for your child. And if that means, you know, dedicated professors who care, if that means the potential for like an affordable education, that there are ways that that can potentially happen at institutions that you might not have automatically thought of when you were thinking of colleges and universities. That by no means solves any problems, but it is a thing that I think is important that sometimes gets overlooked.
Well, didn't someone do, I think maybe out of Brookings or somewhere, did the research that some of these institutions you're talking about are really the economic mobility generators?
Yes,
I
most
don't,
definitely.
I don't remember. It'll come to me who did the research.
And that is a complete, like I attended my state flagship. I love my alma mater. But I do think that there are things that regional public institutions are doing that serve their communities, both local and their state, that matter and that often can provide more resources or opportunities, and that there are these types of institutions that can also meet full need for students that provide wonderful opportunities that we don't often talk about.
My advice, I used to say, again, I'm not an expert in giving advice, but make sure that if you do decide to send your child or you decide to go, take on as least amount of loans as possible. So that may be talking with the university, figuring out if there are any scholarships, grants that you may be eligible for, kind of being a little bit more proactive rather than if you can be. and then getting in and finishing as fast as possible. I'm very direct about, trying not to linger on if you have to go through the process. Now I just add a little bit more to that and say, just make sure you understand what kind of loans you are taking on. So, understanding the difference between the private versus public or federal loans, because it's really, there is different criteria or different like interest rates and different protections around the types of loans that you take on. So, and in particular, when you're in this repayment phase and if you run into difficulties, how the federal government can help you with your loans versus a private institution and who's willing to assist you.
Did each of you, did you have to borrow for school? And I'm thinking about this in your bio, and this is what inspired this question. So you should definitely take it first. Have you borrowed? How recently did you pay it off? How did you feel about it? And how did that experience, if at all, impact the work that you do, inform your research?
You want to start?
Yes, I do.
Okay, sure. So I wrote in my bio that I just recently paid off my loans in June. 17 years after finishing, 6 years deferred for graduate school, and with an NIH loan repayment grant, so with assistance from NIH. Okay. Now again, I've also fallen into a different pool because I have whatever. So yeah, but I think that this is maybe a little unique, but not uncommon amongst my peers who also finished, or some who are still repaying on our loans. I went to a private institution, and also my mother took on some loans for me as well, which she is also still paying on, because my sister also, I have a sister who also attended a public institution. So it's very real. This is very much embedded in my reality, and when I talk about this, it's both from research, but as also a personal perspective. I hear, I know, I ask people the stories when I teach and when I go on and talk about the work that I do. I tell my, especially graduate students who are looking for ideas about what to study and the research, I say sometimes when you don't get the validation within the academia about what your questions or what you want to pursue, it's when you go back into the community and you talk to them, and that's where you get your validation. That's where you get some of your ideas, and that's how you know what you're doing is going to actually touch and is important. And so this is actually what happened a little bit to me, is talking and understanding what was happening amongst my cohort and the cohorts that were coming behind us with regard to student debt.
So I was very fortunate and received a scholarship to my state flagship institution. But my parents took out loans to pay for my room and board, my books, all of that. In addition to that, though, because we were in a special place, because we did a couple extra degrees, but I will say that I 100% recognize, and this is one of the reasons why I think a lot about the debt accumulation side of things, is that while I expected to help my parents pay back that loan that they took out, I was very fortunate that I didn't have to take out any loans in my name to go to college. That's an incredibly fortunate space to be in. And I have to think that in part made me feel more comfortable to work for an AmeriCorps program after I graduated. It made me feel more comfortable to work for my alma mater in a student affairs position, which anyone who has worked in a student affairs position knows not having debt was helpful for that. So right, like it fundamentally helped me to shape my decisions. It made my decision when I was trying to decide where to go for my master's degree. I went where I could work part-time and go to school part-time so that it would be easier for me to finance that. So I think a lot of my personal experiences influence how I would like other people to be able to make decisions based on their interests and if they want to contribute and give back to society, the ways that they could do that without having to feel there's this burden that's sort of hanging over them.
Mm-hmm. So I also have debt, which I very recently also just finished paying off. This is like so much affirmation. I love it. Yeah. And so I always joke with my coworkers that now that I pay my debt off, maybe I should move into a different issue area. But in all seriousness, I think something that I really value is continuing to bring borrower voices to the fore and using both quantitative and qualitative research. So that's why I think the varying degrees survey is so incredibly important, the perception versus reality, the focus groups that New America did. We also, as I mentioned, just wrapped them up, but really marrying those so that you can understand sort of what's happening, but also how people feel about it, because that is really what drives whether or not they take up the good policies that we put in place.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that obviously I went to college and graduate school in a different era and am living proof that that really was a different era because it was far more manageable to me. I mean, like, just like the trends today, I needed to take out a larger loan for graduate school than I did as an undergraduate, but we were poor. And so I got a lot of scholarship aid, I had Pell Grants, you know, it was much easier for me to navigate my undergraduate career. That made it easier as a graduate student. But as a parent, observing my children wanting to go to graduate school and the amount of debt they've taken on, and trying to pay for them so that they didn't have debt as undergraduates, it's just an astonishing difference. And in terms of repayment, sitting with my daughter and trying to help her navigate the various income-based repayment programs, and I think I was the editor-in-chief of Money Magazine. Like, if you don't have a mom or a dad or are not yourself, like, how do people do it? And so I feel very, you know, all of these solutions seem really great, but that in particular resonated with my personal experience. So at this point, I will stop, and I want to throw it open to questions to everyone. But before we do that, I just want to say it was my great pleasure to be able to read not read all of your work, to read samples of your work. And you're making an extraordinary contribution to this space. So thank you. And now questions for our panel.
Thank you for your work in explaining and framing the whole issue of student loans and financing for college. And I was wondering, have you done any work on financial literacy programs and up front in educating students and parents on what options they have and how to pay for college?
Well, I'll say, I think it's on. Hi. So actually, in some of our research, we control for whether or not the financial literacy of the young adults, and find that it doesn't really have much. We don't find any association with debt accumulation. That's not to say that it's not necessarily going to be helpful, because I think financial education is important, and it speaks to what I said, my last comment around understanding the types of loans that you're taking on, because it's going to have very long-term implications later on in the repayment piece. But I also sometimes hesitate with regard to financial education because it shifts the conversation back to the individual, rather than thinking how we can think about how us as a society can help to fix this issue, and I think that's where we need to be focused, not necessarily on individuals, because it's just going to persist if we continue to say, well, this person got financial education, and rather than fixing where where they were, yeah, they made this choice, and therefore it's your issue to deal with now, rather than thinking about the systemic issues that are existing in the problem. So that's usually what I say.
We also heard in the focus groups we did that if people are receiving financial literacy at school or through exit counseling, sometimes they're not experiencing troubles in repayment until 10 years down the line, maybe when they lose a job or they have a kid, or some mitigating, children are not mitigating life circumstances, but some financial shock comes along. And so the ability to have some just-in-time information to either, through their servicer, through the Department of Ed, through their school, we heard was incredibly important and could be transformative.
I'll also say that there's a lot of schools now who have requirements, like before you graduate, you have to take a class. So there are these little quick fixes that people can implement, but it's not, we still have an issue, right, as Sarah alluded to, after. So it's like, oh, we've done this, check it off, so it's kind of puts the issue back on the individual.
And I just say we always have to be careful because it can also work in the reverse. So that article I mentioned that Sidonarsky wrote up in the Times, one of the pieces that it notes is that if we sort of nudge students to think about how much debt they're taking out, but we don't necessarily fully educate them about the opportunities that it's providing them, students may choose to take less debt out and then drop out. And so we also have to think about what is within the content when we say sort of that we're educating individuals about their finances, because we can sometimes push them towards the decision that we may not think is actually helpful, and they may not 10 years down the line either.
And even with, we know this from not just related to student debt, but financial literacy in general, that even when people get education, that is not always what drives decision making, right? So first of all, there's just the power of inertia. But when it comes to something like college, and college for your children and college for yourself, the emotion that drives the decision is very powerful. And there's a new book, Indebtedness, by Caitlin Zaloom, that talks about, that's a thread that runs throughout this. And I can say it again for myself. I took on personal debt through the Parent Plus program, even though I had a colleague who's here today telling me, don't do that, Diane. And it's not like I didn't know as editor-in-chief of Money Magazine not to do that. It's not like I didn't know. And I, counseled my daughter on the amount of graduate school debt she took on. Didn't matter. She wanted the school she wanted the program that she wanted, and that we have to take that just-in-time information into account as well. Oh.
Thank you. This is very interesting. I actually wanted to ask if there's a breakdown between students who take out living expenses and just education debt. In my limited research, there seems to be a huge disparity in terms of communities of color and socioeconomic status and how they do that. Like some of you, I was extremely fortunate to come out of undergrad with no debt, but went into a law program. Again, I was fortunate enough to live at home when I did that, but majority of the students that I went to law school with all took out living expenses. And right now they are planning to pay back their loans as part of their retirement program, because they'll be well into their 60s by the time they're completed paying back the loans. So I'm wondering if there's any deep research there on undergraduate students who are also taking out living expenses.
So I would say that actually a majority of what we are talking about is including living expenses. So that often what we have all been talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, is looking at sort of the full cost of attendance of going to college, so right, tuition and fees, the room and board, whether that's room and board living on campus, or you have decided that you're living at home, right? Like you still have an allotment of what is your cost of attendance at the institution, and that for a lot of what we're talking about, it is including all of those sorts of expenses within as well.
What usually happens is you get approved for however amount, but you can you can take out more than maybe the cost of tuition is, and then you get a refund check, right? And so how do you hold on to that refund check, or do you need to use that refund check to pay for cost of living expenses while you're in college? If you don't have to pay, though, you can hold on to that refund check and swing it into the next semester or the next year to pay down some of your tuition. But a lot of students need that money. They rely on that money for the costs, for the extra costs.
And actually, some of the most interesting stuff I've seen around this is that some researchers have looked to see that even universities that are in the same metropolitan area, they can actually and do actually charge a different amount for, right, all of those living expenses. So one of the things that's really interesting is that living expenses are very, it is autonomous within sort of the institution to make decisions around what their living expenses are. In a way that I think, if we want to talk about like smaller lever points, that would be very useful. It would be useful to think about how it doesn't make as much sense that these 15 universities in Boston all have slightly different charges for how much it costs to eat, right? So those types of things.
More questions?
Hi, thank you for this. It's been really illuminating. In my experience as a dean and then in research after it, I was struck by the prevalence of a second kind of debt problem, maybe crisis, which is what I call institutional debt, unpaid balances that students owe their institution. Something like 30% of all undergraduates end each academic year in arrears to their institution, and a huge number of folks who stop out are blocked from reentry because of the debts that they owe their past institutions. I wonder if you've done any research on the interaction between that institutional debt and student loan debt.
I think there's a thing that I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I believe someone has done some research looking at sort of honor loans, which is slightly different, right? That is actually where you get a line of credit sort of at your institution for a short-term loan that you need to repay. And I think there's been some nascent research looking at for-profits, in particular because some of the lawsuits that have been brought in recent years have shown that sort of some institutions were steered towards specialized types of loans that were institutional only. But I don't know of that much research looking at exactly what you're talking about.
Nor do I know much media coverage of it. That is news to me. That's something that I didn't realize that seems to me worth looking into. Hear that, Newsweek colleagues? More questions?
Thank you. So can I'm going to take over for a second. Can you raise your hand if you have a graduate degree? Wow. So 12% of the population has a graduate degree. And like at least 80% of the people in this room have a graduate degree. So I guess the thing that I try to think about a lot when I'm doing research and writing about student debt is the fact that we are operating in a very skewed environment, and that Capitol Hill is operating in a very skewed environment, and the media is operating in the same environment. And I guess how do you think that we can kind of combat that narrative and illustrate to people how real people are dealing with these issues? Not to say that we're not real people, but we're kind of not.
So I'll jump in first. I think this is why it's incredibly important to bring borrower voices to the fore. And I'll say, as I mentioned several times, we've done a series of focus groups. There'll be a report coming out soon, plug. But when we were doing the focus groups, we did what any responsible research team would do, and we scanned the field to see what had already been done. And we were able to convene everyone that we were aware of that had published on the topic around one table. So I think encouraging people to bring, to your point, borrower voices to the front to really underscore what individual families are dealing with, what their financial situations are, what they're worried about, and also their perception, again, because a lot of DC, believe it or not, traffics in reality in terms of data, right? And I think we don't traffic enough in perception.
I mean, that was the reason behind the cover story. I mean, exactly that, because the narrative is so different than what the reality is for the majority of borrowers. Do we have time for more questions? We have some more back there.
Hi, sorry, from the back of the room. I'm Greg Schuckman from the University of Central Florida. I appreciate the panel. One of the things that we've struggled with in higher ed is about trying to get this narrative to disaggregate by sector, because the debt for publics is much different than the debt for privates, which is very much different from the proprietary institutions. And so in our case, you know, half of our students aren't graduating with any debt. Most of the students, the vast majority of students, are graduating with less than $10,000 of debt. So while this panel was going on, there were two reports actually released. One was by the Census Bureau talking about poverty statistics. Poverty has actually come down 0.5 point, which is staggering. But there was one group where the number actually went up, and it was for people 25 and over without a degree, without a high school diploma. And their poverty statistic is now over 1 in 4. So the people who most need education are the people who don't have it, and they get scared away by these, you know, $100,000, $200,000 of debt. So we have to find a better way to frame this conversation about debt. It's very real, and we're very aware of it. But if we don't target the message by sector better, we're scaring away the people who need the education most.
Yeah, and I'll say, I think this links a lot with the last question, right? That what we try to think about, the writing that I do more often than not is for academic journals, so it's not that scintillating, but I try. But one of the main things, right, is that like often we do a sort of like a hat tip repeat, right? Like these are the facts on the ground. And we try to sort of repeatedly say, these are the facts on the ground about how much do people borrow, what is the average amount, those types of things. I would hazard a guess, right? Like that's part of the reason that this entire event is occurring, is to try to think about what are better ways to clear up misconceptions around borrowing. Excuse me. It might be one of the things is that like if every one of us leaves today and the next time like these types of things come up, we actually say, well, but you know, da-da-da-da, which, I mean, will make you a really great person at a party. But that it might be that a piece of that, like I consider is like stealth acknowledgement of a lot of these topics. Is that like, when my friends talk to me about these types of issues, I mention the ways that public institutions can vary greatly from private for-profit institutions as a particular, if we want to sort of go a wide spectrum. So yeah, I think that's fair.
I'll also say an incredibly important contribution to the field would be more data. A lot of the research and a lot of the information that's out there is limited just because you would think that we know X, Y, and Z things, and many things we just don't know as a field because there aren't nuanced, detailed data, and some of the data we do have lags. So I will put a plug in for additional data. You know, right now we're taking a little bit of a beg, borrow, and steal approach, but if anyone has other good ideas, we are all ears.
But can I ask, like, what are, oh, stop, I got a giant stop. So much to say on this topic, and these were wonderful questions that would have led us to a great conversation, but there is another really great panel waiting to happen. So I just want to thank you for being a great audience, thank New America for having us, and especially thanks to these three great panelists for the insights and the research. Thank you.
Wow, what a great panel. And to continue with the excitement, the conversations, our next conversations is about students. And for this panel this year, we collaborate with the Aspen Post-Secondary Success for Parents Initiative, which is an initiative from the Aspen Ascent programs, and we invited the students to come and share with us about how students with dependence navigate the system. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our next panel. Yes.
Hi. So you guys asked to hear from real people. Guess what? We have real people. This is the best. As these guys get settled, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Melissa Nadwarny. I cover education for NPR. And I've been doing a lot of reporting around students and kind of driven a little bit in part by New America's student perceptions of who we think college students are and who actually are who college students are. So I'm super excited to hear from you guys because you are really the experts on all the stuff we're talking about. So these are all student parents. And we're going to start off by maybe having you guys introduce yourself. About 1/5 of college students are students with dependence. So that's almost 4 million college students. So that's like really good to kind of keep in mind that you guys are part of a massive group of students, right? You're not alone in this. So why don't you start by just kind of introducing yourself, tell us a little bit about you and your kids. We'll start there.
I can start. I'm Brittany Black. I'm currently a manager at a sport clips. So I have an 8-year-old. He'll be 9 at the end of the month. And just like a little bit about my educational journey. So I went to cosmetology school straight out of high school and practiced in the field for some time. Got kind of burnt out, just didn't feel like I was getting anywhere in my career. My mom is a formerly incarcerated woman who struggles with addiction. My dad grew up with the impression that his role was to work and provide for the family. So as far as getting counseling on career education and pathways to education, it was non-existent in my family. So kind of the solution for my dad was get into a trade. That's an easy way to make money, which is what worked for him. So anyways, I went into cosmetology practice for some time and just decided that I needed to get a real job and a real career. So entered into the airline industry and felt really fortunate that I was able to find a really viable career without a degree. Did that for some time, met my son's father, and then we had my son. Through that, there was a relationship that fell apart while I was pregnant, and simultaneously, like within days, I was also furloughed from my job. So within a matter of days, I went from having a really great career to being unemployed, about to be a single mom, homeless, because I was living with his father, and no viable answers of what I should do next. So I found a program called Jeremiah Program. It's a 2-gen program, and their mission is to pull together resources that already exist, social service programs that are already in existence, remove unnecessary barriers to make a pathway for a single mom is who they target specifically to get a degree in a timely way. So I finished my bachelor's degree with a 2-year-old in 2 years. But I couldn't have done that without the assistance of a program like that. Thanks. Yeah. So, and with that program came counseling on, advising on loans, advising on, I had to have an education plan. I was expected to commit to that plan and stay with it. So then that lingering in the educational system didn't happen for me. There was some advising on options to look for, like what loans were available and what those look like and what the repayment for that would be. And when you get that check, they approve you for that X amount of dollars over, and you're literally living off of $300 cash assistance that you had to spend 8 hours in a county office to get. That check looks real nice. Like that looks, that's Christmas presents, that's gas in my car, that's, things, diapers, wipes, you know, that kind of stuff, childcare, because the wait list, I had a hard time getting on, getting assistance for childcare because the wait list was so long. So I guess my point is, it's complicated, and it was a long journey, and I couldn't have done it without the assistance of some sort of program intervening to advise me, because my parents weren't capable of doing that.
So we're going to go down the line, but I just
Sorry.
want to, no, that was great. Just kind of a big thank you to you guys from the beginning, because you guys are going to be talking about your lives, and it's such an honor to hear your stories, and we just really appreciate you guys being like an open book and talking about this stuff, which can be hard. So go ahead, Leslie.
So my name's Leslie Del Rio. I'm from Denver, Colorado. I have a son. He is 8 years old. So I had my son when I was 18. Prior to having my son, I dropped out of high school. Due to my life circumstances, my mom is an immigrant, undocumented, and she lost her job. So I had to go to work. And other things, you know, not just my mom not working. I didn't really see the value in an education, even a high school degree. But after I had my son, I found a program called Florence Scranton Services, which is also a 2-gen program, which is a high school for pregnant parenting teen moms. And so there you take your child to school, to early child care center, and you also take yourself to school and go to high school. And so it's accredited Denver Public School with the Denver Public School curriculum, plus all kinds of wraparound services, so mental health support, assistance programs, things, you know, just like diapers and wipes for good attendance, so you don't feel like you're not raising your child while you're, you know, in high school. And so that was a really good program that I got into that got me through high school. And through that, I really got engaged in the community, in public speaking and leadership and youth sexual health a lot. And so after that, I went to work for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, while simultaneously having a breakup, going through domestic violence, raising my kid, moving out, being 21 years old, entering the workforce, and also going to college at the community college. So as you can imagine, college wasn't my first priority. Surviving was, paying my bills, and the cliff effect is real. So I got off of public assistance because I got a job, and so I lost a lot of things. So I was able to grasp child care assistance, but only for work and not for school. And so I kind of just lingered on in the education system, the post-secondary education system, for a really long time. I took a class here and there, but then I started to move on forward in my career, going into other things like social services, like human services, development, volunteerism, things like that. And I just took a class here and there, but I never really, you know, took the huge step to fully go into college. And that's been my journey. Until last year, I was in the parent panel or parent advisory committee for the Aspen Ascend Institute, and where we did some type of research on post-secondary education on parents with children, or students with children, sorry. And I met somebody from a competency-based education center in Austin, Texas, but I'm from Colorado. And so I cannot move to Texas. And so it's an online school that I was fortunate enough to get into, which was, you know, just lucky of me to meet these people in the time that I did. And so I am now pursuing post-secondary education to Southern New Hampshire University College for America.
My name is Ariel Ventura. I was born and raised in Alexandria, Virginia, which is about 20 or 30 minutes right outside of DC, where we are right now, depending on traffic. I'm a first-generation American. I'm the first in my family to go to college. I have an 8-year-old son who will be 9 in December, and I have a 2.5-year-old daughter. She swears she's 10 years old. But as you can imagine, it is a handful. I originally started my post-secondary education journey in 2009, right out of high school. I was ill-prepared for it at the time. I took on a full-time job, which required maybe 60 hours a week of my time, and so essentially I ended up failing every class and dropping out. A few months after that, my spouse and I ended up pregnant and awaiting the birth of our child. And I felt that I had to work full time. I felt stuck. I took a 5-year hiatus at that same job where I hit the glass ceiling many years before I decided to go back and pursue my post-secondary education. I ended up finding out that college was going to be essential for the success of myself and my family, and to provide some type of financial stability for my family. After that, the reason why I decided to go back to college was because of a scholarship program in the area called Generation Hope, and they believed in me. I think that's the first and most important thing, and they gave me the opportunity to attain access to college. They provide tuition assistance and mentorship as well. I think the mentorship portion has been really the key piece for my success. Being a first gen, navigating the ropes of college can be a very difficult thing to do, especially as a parent, especially with coming from a low-income background. From that point forward, my first few semesters, I ended up earning a 4.0, which is the first time I had ever earned a 4.0 in my life. I had earned, during my journey, besides that scholarship program, I managed to earn 5 more scholarships to pay for my entirety of the tuition at the community college level, because the financial aid wasn't going to be enough to cover everything, while also maintaining, ended up working as a work-study job on the college campus, which was not enough. And that entailed navigating social services, and that was everything. That was SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, just everything. And what I can remember is a lot of the processes for that were very difficult to attain, and they were very difficult to keep. It was a part-time job in itself, having to go to different professors and instructors, having them sign my county form proving that I was actually in class. It was embarrassing nonetheless and degrading a little bit. And so with many challenges and obstacles with that, we just last year, we ended up finally, my wife and I ended up finally coming off of SNAP food stamps, which was a big step for us. And we ended up graduating from the community college, and we each earned our associate's degree on Mother's Day in 2017. And our children were actually in the crowd watching us walk across that stage, being the first in each of our families to attain some sort of college degree. And after that, I secured a job at the community college that I had graduated from. I'm currently a program advisor there for leadership students, and we do a lot of volunteer work in the community, which I call my day job. And a lot of the independent work, or a lot of side jobs, and a lot of the other stuff that I'm really involved in and I really love to do is advocating for post-secondary education, advocating for families of low income, first-generation college students and first-generation Americans, just because I know that if I didn't have the program, the support set in place at the time that I decided to go back, that I don't think I would have been successful in my career. I'm currently studying business management, entering my senior year at George Mason University. I have about a year and a half to go. It's a really busy schedule. Just this morning, getting both kids ready, dropping them off at each of their locations, just to come back here. And after this conference, gonna go scoop them right back, drop them off with my mom, so that I can go to my night class from 7 to 10 tonight, and basically do it all over again tomorrow. And that's where I'm at today.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Joseph, you're up.
I'm not sure how to follow up with that. So good morning. My name is Joseph Yusuf. Not sure where to even start. My daughter, name is Jakayla. She is currently 6 years old, about to be 7. She was born on Thanksgiving. Like I said, I'm not sure where to start. My experience with higher ed. So originally when I was going to college, I started at UDC-CC. And I spent 2 years there, and even just college as a general, like as a expectation, for me, I tell myself I wouldn't have to go to college. I tell myself that I'll be great as a music producer, you can't tell me anything, I'm going to succeed, right? And reality hit me immediately. And I realized, like, even in the process of my daughter being born, I just realized, like, when she came out the womb, I was like, this is the moment where I have to change. And so, you know, from having this mindset to saying, no, college isn't an option. No, I'm not going to college, to saying, oh, hey, wait a minute. I'm going to go to college. And with that mindset, I'm like, all right, if I go to college, I don't want to pay for it. And I was like, how do I pay for it? And I remember just going around searching for scholarships, and one of the first scholarships I came about was Generation Hope, and me and Ariel are still in the same program. But I came across Generation Hope, and I just remember being amazed at a program that was dedicated to young parents, not just young mothers, but young fathers as well. And so for me, that was just a ticket and just the way I wanted to go. And I remember applying to that scholarship. There wasn't really the best, but it gradually got better. I remember after my 2 years there, I put in a transfer for American University and Howard University. Luckily, I got into both, but due to the support, I went with Howard instead. Ever since then, just college, I don't know, I see college as the way to go for me. I appreciate it, and I definitely do love college, and I'm happy that my experiences going to Howard has rubbed off on my daughter. If you ask her right now what college she want to go to, she'll scream, Howard University. So, I'm happy.
Graduated.
Yes,
this
ma'am.
spring.
Thank you.
So, I picked on a couple of threads that I want to follow up with all of you. The first is childcare, because it just feels like we can't talk about being a student parent and going to college without talking about childcare. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, give us a sense of what that looked like, and kind of maybe some of the hard decisions you had to make around childcare. Whether it be you couldn't take classes at night because there's no childcare at night, or bargains you made with family members, or just give us kind of a glimpse into some of those challenges, some of those decisions.
Yeah, I can start. So I have kind of a unique situation, but I think each of our stories are unique, as every family in America is unique, and I think that that's like essentially what the main issue is, right? We're trying to create policy that dictates what's best for the majority, but none of us look the same. So my scenario is that I moved to Minnesota for a job. It was supposed to be a professional move. I was only going to be there for a year, maybe two, and then I was going to go back home to where I had my community. So when my son was born, the only people I knew were people who worked for me. So that put me in kind of a weird dynamic. Then when I lost my job, that community kind of went away. It was a little distant. So I didn't feel like I had anyone to ask, can you watch my son? Can you, like, these sort of things. Same, my son's father's in law enforcement. He works overnight, so 10 at night till 7 in the morning. So the large burden for childcare fell on me to figure that out, especially because I wasn't employed at the time. So in his mind, that, like, what else are you doing? Like, take care of the kid, of course. So then also because of the track that I was on to get my education, it required me to take, I took these 6-week, it would be a semester-long class that was offered in 6 weeks. So they were very intensive classes, but the classes were only offered from 5 to 9 at night. So now I have a 2-year-old in Minnesota in winter that I'm having to, at 10 o'clock at night, pick up from someone's home to then drag back to my apartment, and now it's 11 or so at night. And then I would have daycare assistance during the day through the Jeremiah program, which was helpful, and I'm so grateful for it, but it was a huge burden, and there were times when I needed to take my son to school because I just didn't have an option. So then I was faced with potentially taking my son into the classroom, and then the stress of trying to get a 2-3-year-old to sit still for 4 hours and me focus on what's happening in class. But then also the potential humiliation of a professor asking me to leave the class because I wasn't subscribing to what we feel like is the norm of a college student.
Did that ever happen, or was that just a fear?
No, it did happen, yeah. And actually in a psychology class with a female professor, which was, I felt extra hurtful because it was just like, you seriously can't, like, see that I'm literally trying to do the best I can. So yeah, it was a constant daily struggle. So on top of then managing work and, you know, grocery shopping and laundry and potty training and these sort of things, then I'm also like, who's gonna watch my kid 3 nights a week, and getting to class and all those other barriers. So it's just like an additional layer of stress.
You mentioned earlier wait list, that you were on a wait list.
Yeah.
Is that?
As far as I know, I'm still on the wait list. Yeah, I've never gotten notification that we, like, moved up on the list. I've never, so yeah, it was early childhood education I forget, I still have the papers, but it's the wait list, and they don't even give like a idea of when potentially, like an estimate of in 10 years you might have childcare options for you.
Joseph, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, so when you were in school, you were living with your mom and your grandmother, and you know, we talked a little bit about how that's kind of built-in childcare, but it has maybe some disadvantages. You know, there's still conversations there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
For me and my household, where I used to live, I had I was fortunate enough to live with my mother and grandmother, and for me, it wasn't much of a problem. It was like, hey, I gotta go to school. You mind washing her? Great. But the thing is, when you're great at something, you don't do it for free. And it's like with my grandmother, it's like money talks, you know? It's like, yeah, I do love you, and yeah, you're my grandson, but I need that at the end of the day. And so I guess if there was any problems, it was just being able to pay her for her skill. But it was always a good experience. Even when I did take my daughter to class, my professors were always cool with it. I was like, you got a daughter? Man, bring her on. I was like, wow, that's kind of amazing, because usually when you have that experience, it's like, that's a distraction, no. But to have her come into class and to have her want to, you know, act like a student and learn something and write something, it was just always good experience.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of some of the frictions that you felt experiencing college. I mean, Leslie, you and I talked about night classes, how people kind of assume like, oh, night classes will be great for people with flexible schedules. This is not actually true.
For me, it was a little difficult, and it was just a personal choice that I had to take, because being a single parent, being the only person that's raising my child, I really had to think about what I valued more. Was it education, or was it raising my child the best that I could, and being there to pick him up, to drop him off from school, be there to do his homework, be there at football practice and do all of these things, be there for his nighttime routine. And that was something that I lacked in my life, and I really, really wanted to give him, right? Because we had all of these other risk factors going on in our lives. I really wanted to provide that protective factor in home of, you can always count on your mom. Your mom will be there before school, after school, when you're brushing your teeth, to potty train you, to do all these things. And so, yeah, night school was an option, and I did take some night classes, but just like Joseph, I had to rely on my family and friends to do that. And I did that for about two classes, 2 semesters, and I didn't want to do it anymore. Just because, you know, he was already away at school while I was at work, and I just missed a lot, and I felt like it wasn't worth it to me. And people always think like, oh, well, you're working, I'll just take night classes. Yeah, but there's no childcare. And furthermore, there's no childcare for kids above 4. Right, even if you take morning classes, it's only early childcare, right? It's only, or sometimes it's even just kindergarten. And so I have an older kiddo, right? He was 1st and 2nd grade kindergarten, and there wasn't any childcare provided in the college campus for him. And so I needed to work while he was at school, and I wanted to go to school when he was out of school, and it just didn't work out for me. And I never took him to school just because I always had that fear of, you know, I think maybe it's a mom thing, right? It's like a mom shame. I always felt like someone was going to tell me, get out of here, you can't have kids here, kids are not allowed in here, or something like that. So that's why I chose the path that I have now, and it's actually been working really, really well for me to do online classes. So I get to choose, you know, when I get to sit down and do this. I could do it at his football practice, or we go every Tuesday and Thursday, meet with my tutor and my advisor at a library. So he's doing a library activity, and I'm watching him, and I'm there with him, and I'm, you know, talking to my advisor or getting tutoring. So it's worked out great for us, you know. Even on the weekends, if I have some time, he'll go to the park while I'm on my computer, or during football practice, or whatever sport he's into. This season, he's doing practice, and I'm on my computer, and I'm physically there, and, you know, he'll wave at me, and I'll wave back, and stuff like that. So I'm present, but I'm still, you know, working towards my personal goal.
So you all have kind of talked about how you had maybe perceptions of what college is, and kind of maybe what your professors would say, or what people would kind of think about you on campus. I wonder if you could straighten some of that stuff up for us. Like, what are some misperceptions that people have about who goes to college, or what do you want people to know about being a student parent?
It's hard.
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, jump in.
I think that some of the misperceptions are the fact that student parents they don't have motivation or they lack interest in participating, and it's the fact that we just can't. One of the biggest misperceptions is statistics actually show that student parents are less likely to graduate than traditional students, right? And it can be misperceived that it's because we don't have that motivation or driving force, but we do. They couldn't be more wrong that that's what it is. It's the fact that we don't have the supports set in place, and the universities and colleges tend to cater to other programs and departments. So I think that's one of the biggest misperceptions.
I would say this, and this is no offense to any foreign exchange students, but we're not foreign. Like, we are students. We're just parents first. And honest God truth, we probably work twice or 3 times just as hard. We definitely always do need that support, and just don't be afraid to help us out. Whether that's just a simple, hey, how are you doing today? Hey, how's your daughter doing? Like, we're humans,
I think a misperception that I have encountered is, that I'm not I'm not engaged, or I didn't want to be there, or like that kind of stuff. And it's like, well, literally getting a C in psychology will get me this piece of paper that I need to have, and that is all I can manage right now. So it's like I was up until 2 o'clock with a screaming child. Like, this is not a priority. So, and that conversation had to be had with several professors, and I was in an adult education program. So the program was supposed to be catered to adults, and so it blew my mind that, like, you don't even understand, like, who you're teaching right now, that you would make such a wild statement to me that I don't care about your class. It's not that. It's just that I only had 45 minutes to give to this paper that you are having me write that literally nobody else is ever going to read. So it wasn't a big priority. Yeah, the perspective of it, that, my screaming child took that time out of being able to put what I actually wanted to put into that paper. So if we shifted the perspective, instead of that I wasn't working hard enough, and the professor would have came to me and said, like, my experience with you is that you're very articulate and thoughtful and these sort of things. This paper doesn't reflect that. Is there something going on? Is there something happening? Is there something that I can do to make this better for you? Or anything like that would have been nice. Yeah.
I wonder, so you mentioned about motivation. People don't think you're motivated.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your motivations. Tell us. What motivated you to get your degrees, or to keep going, or to go back to school, and what motivates you now?
I can start with that one. So for me, being in the workforce and having a lot of experience in different fields, and being fortunate enough to get to do that with a high school diploma, I had a lot of doors shut on me. And so I went to interviews and people that I knew, and I've dedicated myself to the nonprofit world in Colorado. And so, everyone's like, hey, we've heard great things about you and blah, 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 but you don't have an education. That sucks. You don't have a degree. That sucks. You have great experience, you do great work, but you don't have a degree. Sorry. And so that's been one of my motivations, is I do want the flexibility. I do want, just that accreditation to my skill set, to my experience, to back me up. But also for my child, one of my advisor actually, I was having a hard time with completing work when work got busy and things like that. And she kind of just said, you've invested a lot in the community and in your son and doing all of these things. When are you going to invest in yourself? And that's really stuck to me, because I feel like I've done a lot of good work in my community and with my son. I'm fortunate enough to say that I feel like he does have a really good life, but I don't think that I have invested in myself as much. With that, being a degree, and that's my goal in post-secondary education, and all of those good things that come with it. And so I think that's my motivation, is now, my son is in a good place. He's not a baby. And I think that's one of the misconceptions that people have about student parents, is that we all have babies. Like everyone, like they're all babies, and they're not. They're some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are teens, so they're varying ages. But He is in a good place now that, I think he sees me, and he's like feels proud of me, and that's also my motivation too, is him seeing me go, meet with these people and do schoolwork and sit down and do homework together. All those things, it motivates me because he sees it, and he talks about it, and he reflects it, which is really good.
I would say that it's a lot to do with my children too, but it also comes from my roots and my heritage. My mom came to the United States in 1989 to seek a better life. She escaped a war-torn country which had no hope for her, probably no life for her out there. And she came here because she wanted the future of her children to be bright. And I feel, or I take it as, that she brought me to a platform that I can have the opportunities that I have and I'm afforded today. She wanted to go to college, but she wasn't afforded that opportunity. She was not allowed to in her country. And coming here with just a few dollars in her pocket, she had to get right to work. And so I feel that, she passed me the beacon, passed me the torch so that I can also, she brought me this high, I got to get this much higher for my children, and I expect them to do the same.
I would say for me, just thinking about that question, I had a moment where I had to reminisce. I think the reason why, and just make sure your question is, okay, I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yeah,
just make sure I was going to say.
Just what motivated you, or what motivates you
Gotcha.
now?
So I just remember being at this party before I even thought about college. And I remember talking to this lady, and I was like, yeah, you got a nice car, and that's great and all that. She's like, yeah, you want that? I was like, yeah. And she was like, well, you won't be able to have it. And I was like, why? She was like, without your degree, you're just going to be another, I would love to say the word, but obviously restrictions. But she was just like, you'll be another, I'll say victim. And it stuck with me, and it was like, wow, that's life. Like, to a certain degree, if you don't have that paper, if you don't have that validation, what can you really be? And I told myself, I was like, from that day on, I'm going to be somebody. I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to be the best dad ever. I'm going to be the best student. And from there, I've continued to basically live it, be the best I can possibly be.
I wonder, so you guys are the experts. I started that with it, us talking about that. What do you suggest for policymakers or for presidents of colleges to make those spaces easier to navigate for you, or make you feel more welcome? Do you have any suggestions for them from your experience?
What I would suggest, and this is what I wanted to do before I left Howard, you know how on campuses you see banners of like the famous people and just your average student? How come you never see student parents on those flyers? How come? We're there. You have a population, it may not be the biggest, but there's a population where student parents exist. Advocate for us. Show us. Let us see ourselves on your campus. I'm tired of seeing the old black and white. I'm tired of seeing these young faces, not like that, but I'm tired of just seeing these like defaults. Yeah. Like, I'm tired of it. Like, change things. Let me see me,
I think too, for me, it was, creative scheduling, priority registration, on campuses where parking and childcare aren't offered, yet athletes are getting these things. And let's talk about where our priorities are. Are we trying to, use education as a lever for change? Then we need to offer it to those people. We need to make sure that it is a lever for change and that it's not something being sold to people who, when you're in, a certain demographic, then it becomes another shackle that keeps us in poverty.
I just think about what the gentleman said earlier about the populations that need it the most are the ones that are, that don't have access to it. And so, like Joseph was saying, yeah, these conversations happen here, but I don't think they happen enough outside of these conversations, right, outside of these walls, outside of these conferences. Student parents exist. They exist in many different ways, but in a lot of ways we're invisible, right? And it's not to say that every student parent wants to talk about their children, and some of them don't ever even disclose that. I mean, somebody in our cohort never disclosed that she was a student parent because of the fear of the shame that would come with it. And so some of us are invisible. Some of us hide our struggles and our barriers. And so I would call on to the presidents of colleges and universities, policymakers and people to think about this population, because we are there. We have been there for a really long time, and we do need unique things like what Brittany was saying, and also thinking about us individually, right? And so that's really hard to do when everyone's story is so different, but also, you know, the struggles are overarching. And so thinking about us as an individual, but as a population in general, and what the challenges are. And I think that would make it even more appealing for a lot of people, even people that need it the most, right? Like the population that the gentleman was talking about, over 25, right, that only have a high school diploma. Those are the people that need it the most, and those are probably the people that have children by now, right? 25 to 30, they have children, and they cannot go back to school when we don't see ourselves on the flyers, when we don't see anything advertised for student parents, for priority registration, for childcare, for after-school activities or transportation, things like that. I think the barriers are way, way more than, you know, than what even people can think about. So I would just make it a challenge to talk about student parents, talk about the solutions or the breakdown of the barriers when you're having conversations with people in power.
I would say invest in programs and resources that support student parents. I don't know how many college presidents would actually be aware of how many student parents are actually attending their campuses and at what times of the day they're actually going to class, but providing additional supports, like I possibly can't make it to general advising from 9 to 5 because I'm working during that time, or I'm taking care of my child and I'm going to night class, and when I need to find out what's going on with my financial aid, the offices are closed and I have to wait till next week to take a day off, stuff like that. Going on the website, my first year at Mason, the summer before I attended, I was looking up all over their website for about an hour straight, some supports for student parents. I looked up student parents, I looked up parent learners, I looked up so many search criteria that I looked up, I couldn't find it. I found students' parents, but it's not quite the same thing. And even at the new student orientation, where all the departments and all the faculty and staff are there for supposedly every type of student, here I am going from table to table, trying to find the support or resource that would best accommodate me, and they could not point me in the right direction for student parents. So just trying to understand that there are student parents on campus that do attend and that they do have additional barriers, and invest in those supports and invest in those resources.
And I'll add on to that. Just like how we love for athletes to come to our colleges, make scholarships for us. Make scholarships and grants. Let us apply as well. Very simple.
So you mentioned more supports, and we haven't really talked about that much. I mean, you've talked a little bit about the programs that you've been into. What were some things or moments that really helped you, whether it be support or a program or a mentor?
I can say at the community college level, there were so many supports there for me at the time that I went, which is Northern Virginia Community College. They had this program called Adult Career Pathways at the time, where it was for non-traditional students, generally over the age of 24, generally working, student parents and such, and they provided a holistic approach, and so that included a case management where my advisor would meet me at a Wegmans or meet me at a Starbucks after hours at 7:30 after I got off work with my children there to help me select classes for next semester or help me find out what's going on with my financial aid. And so they also provided me with resources. They also directed me in the way I needed to go if I had a social service issue. They had a dual generation initiative on the campus where there were programs and trainings for both myself and my children to attend during weekends and stuff, where generally people maybe aren't working. They had back to school drives, they had diaper banks, they had a lot going on for student parents. Unfortunately, that funding was cut but I had graduated at that point, but that funding was cut now. So when I transferred over to the four-year university, I didn't see any of that at all. I felt like a small fish in a big pond. So those were, as far as my success at the community college level, stuff like that, a dual generation initiative, or just programs for student parents like that.
Yeah, and that sends a message to you.
Yeah.
That we're investing in you and people like you.
I was able to leverage a program at my community college, ASAP. I forget what the actual acronym is, but it's Accelerated Success for adult learners. So they have created a program where I was able to leverage my work experience in the airline industry. And so I was able to then write a massive paper addressing all the 8 criteria that would have been addressed on the syllabus for that class had I taken it. The benefit to that was, there was a lot of benefits, but the per credit tuition was significantly less. The time that I spent in an actual classroom in front of a professor was the 2 hours when I had to present my paper and have a dialogue with the professor, and they either said, yes, you pass, or no, you don't, and I either got the credit or I didn't. But I, in one semester, was able to take 36 credits, and that's the only way I was able to get my bachelor's degree in 2 years. But I had all this work experience, and a lot of parents do, and so and a lot of people do, so why are we wasting people's time and having them spend all this unnecessary time in college paying these insane amounts of money for tuition when they have this experience? Let's get them into a class where they're actually going to learn something that they can then take into the workforce and impact our whole community.
Yeah, and Leslie, you're also doing a competency-based program right now, so does that resonate with you?
It does, yeah. I think where I thrived in my high school, we had a lot of wraparound supports, right? So, and I mentioned that, and FlowCrit was great at that. And so being really supported and feeling really empowered as a mom and as a learner, and then jumping into college and in the workforce, I thrived in the workforce because I was seen as an adult and stuff like that. But in the college, I wasn't seen as my whole self, and so I did not function well. I did not do well. And so now with this competency-based education, like Brittany was saying, I can take a lot of classes and prove that I know how to write an essay, prove that I know how to do an Excel spreadsheet, and get those credits really quickly, right? I know how to do resume and cover letter because I've done that for so long. So I can showcase my experience and my skills and get credit for those, but then like MOU, now I need to learn how to do that, right? And all these things. Memorandum of understanding. I don't know. Is that yes? Okay. I'm still learning. And so, I need to spend more time on that. So I'm not going to pass that, get that credit because I still need to do it. And so that's why I meet with my tutor and with my advisor and things like that. And so feeling really supported again and feeling like I can showcase my whole self has really been helpful for me and has been a pivoting point in thinking about education and its worthiness in my life.
So that's our time. We're going to open it up for some questions. Thank you guys so much. We're going to talk with you guys, but this is great, right? Hearing from real people. You guys are awesome. Do we have questions? They're open books. You can ask anything.
So if you had the opportunity and you were in a position of authority and power to do things differently so that it would make your life easier or others who are coming up behind you, what would you suggest or recommend?
I think one of my biggest things is I could go really big and say everyone needs a type of support system for parents who are students in your colleges. That means wraparound supports like mental health services at the time and place that they need them to be, childcare, all these things, transportation, work, or some type of funding, so all like rent assistance, all that stuff. But for me, I feel like if the services that I got provided in high school that got me through that time can also transfer into college, I would have done it in no time, right? I would have maybe even been doing my master's by now, to be honest with you. And so I feel like partnering up with people, right? Not recreating the wheel, but partnering up with people that have the funding, that have the resources, that have this nailed down, and transferring it into a college setting. Because if you're a small facility and you don't have the funding to do it, you don't know where to start, partnering up with people who can, and maybe finding funding opportunities to expand that into your college or into your facility or whatever that is.
I'd piggyback on that and just saying, yeah, looking at systems that are already in place and like what can we do to unsilo the social service system so that that's more accessible for student parents, so that I'm not spending 5 to 7 days in the social service office every month to try and just get food on my table so that I can focus on my degree. Child care centers on campus, like it's wild to me that 25% of a population on a campus has a child, and like there's nowhere for me to put the kid. Like what do I do with him? Like so that like just I think little things like that could make a huge difference. And then just looking at like is your scheduling flexible? Are you looking for creative ways to solve problems? So yeah, you might have like this policy that blankets for the large majority, but then what about those people that don't fit that criteria? Like what then is the pathway for them? Like where do they go? Do they just drop off your radar and you don't care because they don't fit into this pretty box that looks nice when you present to people that are funding? Or are you saying they're important to us because they're part of our community and we want to like move our community forward?
In addition to working for UCF, I was also on the board of Northern Virginia Community College, so I was really happy to hear the experience you had at Nova, and I'm glad that we served you well. The point you made about writing the massive paper that got you the 36 credits, I think that you're referring to something called a portfolio learning assessment. And PLAs are a really useful tool, as you pointed out, to getting credit. You had to enroll in a class, though, right, in order to do that?
Yep.
So that was how you were able to pay for that assessment, was actually by enrolling in a class. Because federal aid doesn't pay for the cost of PLAs. You have to do the class in addition. Did the school make it easy for you to understand how to do that? Did they frame it in a way that said you can get this many credits or this many credits depending on what you do? I'm just really curious.
I feel like really lucky. I ended up in a class with a professor, and him and I just jived right away. And he's like, what are you doing in this class? Like, did you know that we have this whole program? Like, why are you taking this class? And I was like, well, because I want to get this degree, and this is my plan. And when I started at the Jeremiah program, my initial plan was only to get my associate's degree. So I had 24 months to complete. That was all that they were then committing to help me, was for 24 months. So then after this conversation with this professor, this program exists here. And so he helped get me connected with the advisor that was running the program. From there, it was the next semester I was enrolled in the class that laid out like how, so there was a semester-long course that I had to take. In that class, you were sitting with other people that were gonna do these PLAs with you, and you mapped out then what your, I think my degree is even an independent learning degree with a focus on business administration. So that was what I picked, and then from there, these were the criteria that I had to meet to get that. And then we went through and like with my resume, I can take this, and then we looked at like mapping it all out, and like, so I knew when I was gonna take each of my classes before I even registered for I think it was like my third class. Like I had my whole 2 years mapped out. But I mean, I could have even done it faster. I wasted an entire semester taking 2 traditional classes that I literally didn't need to take at 3 times the cost of what it would have taken me to take those through a PLA.
And, I mean, it just happened because you had that conversation with
Because
the
I had
professor.
that professor, yeah. Nobody from the university, as far as like in administration or admissions, ever, and they knew I had a kid. They knew I was, an adult. They knew I had, this career background. I had had 2 careers at that point, and nobody had offered this as like a solution or an option, or even like, would you be interested in this? Is this something that you would want? But it also blows my mind that that's not something that's on every campus. Like, why is that not a thing everywhere. I don't know. Probably money.
I think there was another question in the back.
Sorry.
Hey there, thanks so much for joining us. This is incredible. So again, if this is too personal, don't answer it. But I'm thinking about our first panel, which was talking about student debt, and I was wondering if any of you took on debt, and if you did, how did you think about that? And if you didn't, why didn't you? You know, just all of those questions. And if you did take it, what did you use it for? Like, did you use it for childcare? Did you use it for anything else?
All right, so I'll start with it. So I have, hello, there we go. All right, so right now my debt is at $22,000, and that's including the, what is it, interest. There we go. 10,000 of that just came this last year. And that was just me being like goofy and being a senior and just being like, you know what, it's going to get paid back eventually. Why not ball out? Very close. But for the most part, I definitely use it for childcare. I know when I first received one of those refunds, I was like, you know what, Jacayla, we're going to go get you some Howard gear and get you some shoes. There we go. We're going to get you some Howard gear, get you some shoes. We're going to have a good play date, all that good stuff. And I remember doing all of that. And I was like, this is worth it. But then I was like, man, I still have to pay this back. But at the end of the day, it's like, I know I'm capable of paying it back. Why not do it? I'm okay with it.
Well, there comes a point, too, when it's just like you've gone so long without that you're like I've worked so hard. Like, when do I get some sort of like reward or validation? Because so I've taken out debt. I took out debt for my cosmetology school. So because my mom's a 2-time felon, it made getting FAFSA for cosmetology school incredibly difficult. So I went out and got married when I was 18 because that seemed like a really great solution. Yeah. So was able to get, you know, the student loans and like that kind of stuff, but then also got really bad advice after I finished my cosmetology. The interest rates are really low. Don't worry about it. Just pay the minimum, you know, that kind of stuff. So I carried that loan for a really long time, and then catastrophic events happened that were beyond my control. A relationship ending, a child, you know, like ending up homeless without a job, like all these sort of things. That then I was like, now I have this debt from all these years ago, and now somebody's telling me that the only way for me to change my family's trajectory is to incur more debt to go get this college degree. And now I have the college degree, and the thing I think is so ironic about it is nobody pays me more money to cut their hair because I have a bachelor's degree. Not one person. So the irony of it is that I now have this bachelor's degree in business administration. I do use it. I do find it useful, but I could have ended up in the exact same spot I'm in now without that bachelor's degree. I do feel a sense of security knowing that if something were to happen to my physical body, carpal tunnel, or I fall and break an arm, or a car accident and I'm paralyzed and can't stand anymore, like that is no longer a viable career for me. So I do find a lot of peace in knowing that I have this piece of paper that I do feel like opens a lot of doors for me.
And so you still carry that debt now?
I still have some debt, yeah, but considering I have I got an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, and also my cosmetology license. I set this BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal this year to get my debt paid off. It won't happen this year, but I put a crazy big dent in it, and it's only because of this platform that Aspen Institute has given me through events and stuff like this that I've done, that I've been able to put a big chunk of money away to be able to chip away at it. But it's hard when sorry, I can never talk without getting emotional. It happens every time. I almost made it. It's hard, though, when you feel like you've worked so hard to change your family's legacy. And now the thing that I look at is, how the hell is my son going to go to school? I can't pay for my own school. Like, how am I going to do that for him? And it just seems really overwhelming. And when I look at that interest rate every month and the payment is just barely covering it, it's so demeaning, and it just, like, why bother? I can take that $200 and put it somewhere else, or $400 or $500, whatever it is, and you can see impacts in your daily life much quicker. So I think that that's where some of that decision making comes, where you know you need to pay it because the interest is accruing, and that's important. But also, if I put it towards, you know, making a memory with my son or whatever, like, is there more value in that? And I think that's where a lot of those decisions are coming in. It's not that we're uneducated, that we need, you know, somebody to sit and lecture us on good financial decisions. That's not it. It's that there's a whole plate of things that we're trying to juggle and balance, and sometimes the memories are worth it.
For me, the first loan I took on was my final semester at the community college, and it wasn't to pay for tuition or books or parking or anything like that. It was because I was unemployed for 3 months, and I was literally charging everything on my credit card because I didn't have a dollar to my name. And so it was to start paying that off, and I finally got employed, and I missed a couple of payments on my credit card. I communicated to the creditors and my bank, and you know, they said it was going to be fine as long as I make a payment next month. And literally the second day of my new job, I needed gas. I was on E, and I swiped my credit card, and it was declined. And would you believe that creditors don't care? So I had to figure it out from that point. But a lot of the expenses of what you're asking, you know, were non-tuition expenses. They were day-to-day life because, you know, we're living paycheck to paycheck.
And there's no more time to, like, work anymore.
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah. Like I can't get
That's
up
right.
anymore. I can't do any less sleep. I can't. Yeah, like there's.
That's right.
Tapped.
Exactly. And so all the expenses, they went for groceries. They went for car repair, you know, car maintenance. Every semester I'd have my check engine light that come on at the exact same time at the second week into the semester. And I'm like, damn. But to answer your question, yeah, a lot of the loans that I've taken out is just for day-to-day living for myself and my children.
I think for me, I don't have any school debt, and it's because I had a hard time. I guess I come from a family, an immigrant family, that has no debt at all, and it's because we can't. I think for me, I don't have any debt, and that's, I think, what slowed me down in taking one class because I've relied on solely getting all scholarships to take one class, to take 2 classes, to do this work, to do my schoolwork. And so, and all my scholarships that I've got, they've been baby ones, like 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, little baby ones every semester, every time that I can get one. And it all goes to tuition and with FAFSA. So I've been really lucky and not to have any debt.
Well, thank you guys so much. Let's give them a round of applause. Woo. Did it. All right, we're done.
Thank you all for sharing your story. I think it's really incredible and gave us a lot of thought. And I just want to close by just rephrasing what Leslie just said before. Like, the conversation may end now, but it's not gonna end. Like, it's not gonna really end. Give us a lot of thought. Think about how we should do to help our students better. And just once more time, thanks all our panelists for coming. I know a lot of you have to travel for this event, so thank you. And thank you our team at New America. You guys are amazing to put this work together. Our partner at NORC and the Gay Foundation for funding this work. And thanks you all for coming. And have a nice day.